She was 65 years old when the fish company she had weighed and graded catch for since she was a girl of 19 told her that her eyes and her hands had finally grown too slow for the work. Her name was Constance Rourke, and the man who dismissed her was Bartholomew Ives, the grandson of the very founder who had first taught her to judge the firmness of a herring by touch alone. She left the Icehouse dock that afternoon with a small tin of savings, a coat gone thin at the elbows, and exactly $2 once her room was paid through the week. So when she heard that the harbor town of Cold Spring Landing was finally selling off its old abandoned ice house on the point, shuttered for 15 years since the ice trade collapsed and its roof half fell to rot, she offered her $2 for it outright, certain that no sane buyer wanted a crumbling shed full of sawdust and old regret. The auctioneer laughed before he took her money. But beneath the ice house's old sawdust floor, packed hard and frozen in memory, if not in fact, was something that would not only give Constance back the dignity a lifetime of labor had earned her, but would return to the whole fishing harbor a debt it had never known it owed. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Constance Rourke. If you have ever given the best years of your work to a place that discarded you the moment you slowed down, tell us in the comments. We would be glad to know you're not the only one who has felt that particular sting. Constance Rourke was born in 1841 in Cold Spring Landing, a modest harbor town on the rocky coast of Maine, where her father, Duncan Rourke, worked the ice trade that once made small towns like theirs briefly improbably prosperous, cutting great blocks from the frozen ponds inland each winter and packing them in sawdust to ship south to cities that had no winter of their own. Duncan was a quiet, careful man who believed that ice, more than any other trade, rewarded patience and punished carelessness in equal measure, for a block cut too thin would shatter under its own weight before it ever reached a ship's hold, and a house packed too loosely would lose half its cargo to melt before it cleared the harbor mouth. He raised Constance, his only child after her mother died, bringing her into the world, not as a girl to be sheltered from the icehouse floor, but as a hand to be trained upon it, and by the time she was 13 she could judge, by the particular ring a block made when struck with the flat of an axe, whether it would hold firm through a long southern voyage or crumble before it ever left Maine waters. It was not, in that era, thought proper for a girl to spend her winters knee-deep in sawdust and her summers hauling nets alongside fishermen twice her size, and there were women in the town's small congregation who murmured that Duncan Rourke did his daughter no favors raising her to a trade with no future in skirts. But Duncan told her, in words that outlived him by decades in her memory, that ice and fish were both, in their way, the same lesson taught twice, that a thing perishable and easily wasted could, with the right patient handling, be made to last far longer than anyone expected, and that a person who learned to see value in what was fragile and fleeting had learned something almost nobody else in the world bothered to learn. When the ice trade began its slow decline in the 1870s, done in by new mechanical refrigeration that no longer needed ponds and saws and sawdust pack cellars, Duncan adapted without complaint, turning the same patient eye toward grading and packing the harbor's fish catch instead, and it was in the second trade, fish rather than ice, that Constance would spend the greater portion of her working life. She married at 22 a fisherman named Silas Pruitt, a broad-shouldered, gentle man who worked the same waters his own father had worked, and together they had one son, a boy named Thomas, who grew into a fine, steady young man before a fever took him in the winter of 1878, a loss in which Constance never fully recovered even as she carried on, because carrying on, her father had taught her, was simply what one did with grief too heavy to set down. Silas himself was lost at sea in 1883, when a sudden autumn storm caught his boat 2 miles off the point, and Constance, widowed at 42 and childless, found in the fish company's ice house the same steady, undemanding companionship that the sea itself had once offered her husband, work that asked nothing of her but her attention and her patience, and gave back, in return, the quiet dignity of being useful. The fish company that ran Cold Spring Landing's docks in those years was owned by a decent, whether man named Elias Ives, who had inherited the business from his own father, and who valued Constance's uncanny eye for grading catch, an eye trained across decades that could sort a boat's hull into its proper grades faster and more accurately than any of the younger hands he tried out beside her over the years. Elias paid her fairly, treated her with the plain respect one skilled tradesperson affords another, and it was under his ownership that Constance spent the most settled and useful decades of her working life, becoming, without ever seeking the position, Something like the unofficial conscience of the Icehouse floor, the person whose judgment on a questionable batch of herring was never seriously doubted by buyers up and down the coast. She trained, across those years, no fewer than 6 younger workers in the trade, believing as her father had that a skill worth having was a skill worth passing on, and she took particular pride in one young woman, a quick and earnest girl named Hattie Doyle, whom Constance mentored with something approaching the tenderness she had once given her own lost son. It was Elias Ives's grandson, Bartholomew, who inherited the company in 1893 after Elias's death, and who brought with him from his years of business schooling in Boston the conviction that the old ways of the Icehouse, the patient hand grading his grandfather had valued so highly, belonged to a century that was rapidly closing. Bartholomew was not a cruel young man, but he was an impatient one, eager to prove himself against the modern standards he had studied, and when a supplier from Boston began pressing new mechanical grading equipment on him that promised faster throughput at lower wage costs, Bartholomew convinced himself, over the course of a single autumn, that the future of his family's business required shedding the older workers whose slower, hand-trained methods and new machinery was meant to replace. Constance Rourke, at 65 the oldest and most experienced hand still working the Icehouse floor, was the first and most obvious casualty of this new conviction. Bartholomew called her into the small dockside office on a gray November morning and told her, with the particular discomfort of a young man delivering news he suspects his own grandfather would have refused to deliver, that the new equipment would be handling the grading work by spring, and that he did not believe her methods, however respected, would translate usefully to it. He offered her 2 weeks' wage as severance in the observation, meant kindly but landing otherwise, that a woman of her years had surely earned some rest. Constance did not argue, having learned long before that arguing with a young man convinced of his own modernity was a poor use of what breath she had left. She settled her small debts in town, paid her room to the coming week, and found, counting what remained in her tin, that she possessed exactly $2, along with a lifetime of trained judgment that the world had just informed her no longer had a market. It was in this state, $2 in her tin, and a trade she could no longer practice, that Constance heard the town selectmen were finally clearing the old abandoned icehouse out on Cold Spring Point, a relic of the ice trade her own father had once worked, shuttered since 1880, when mechanical refrigeration finally made ice cutting unprofitable even for the last holdout operators. Its roof partially collapsed under 15 winters of snow. It was no longer maintained to shed. The town wanted the eyesore gone or sold, and had scheduled a small public auction on the courthouse green, more out of tidiness than any expectation of serious sale. Constance walked out to the point the morning of the auction and stood before the old building a long while before the bidding began, feeling something stir in her that she had not felt in years. The particular, private recognition of a thing everyone else had already given up on. When the auctioneer called for bids, the small gathering of townsmen laughed outright, several remarking that they wouldn't pay $2 to haul away the rotted lumber, let alone on the crumbling structure itself. Constance stepped forward and offered her $2 anyway, and the auctioneer, more amused and serious, accepted it as a formality to close the county's books on a property nobody actually wanted, writing her out a deed to a collapsing ice house that every other person present considered worth less than the nails holding it together. The building itself, when Constance walked its interior properly for first time in decades, was exactly as sorry as she'd expected and worse in places. Its northern wall bowed inward under the weight of a partially fallen roof, its old sawdust insulation gone to a black, compacted mat across the floor that had clearly frozen and thawed and frozen again through 15 untended winters. But it was that very floor, packed sawdust over hard-packed earth, that drew her attention on her first full afternoon inside, because she noticed, working her way carefully along the building's edge, a section near the northern wall, where the sawdust sat noticeably higher than the rest, mounded in a way that 15 years of settling should have long since flattened. Constance Rourke had spent a working lifetime reading exactly this kind of small, physical inconsistency, the kind that told a trained eye something had been disturbed and deliberately restored, and she knelt by lantern light that first evening and began working her way down to the packed sawdust with a garden trowel, uncertain what she expected to find, but certain, in the old familiar way, that something waited there. What she found some 2 feet down was not ice, long since melted from whatever purpose it once served, but a sealed metal strongbox, rusted at its hinges but intact, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved its contents remarkably well against the packed cold and dark. Inside, when she worked the corroded lock free with the same trowel, she found a bundle of papers, a modest but real collection of gold and silver coin, and a folded letter addressed in a careful, aging hand, to whoever finds this, when the ice trade is finally done. The letter had been written in 1880 by a man named Obadiah Fenn, who had Constance learned from the papers accompanying it, been the Icehouse's last independent owner before the trade collapsed entirely, a man whose small operation had, unlike the larger consolidated ice companies of the region, never been swallowed into the newer fish-packing conglomerate that eventually took over most of the harbor's commercial waterfront. Fenn's letter explained, with the plain, unhurried clarity of a man who believed he was writing for a reader decades removed from his own troubles, that he had discovered, in his final years running the Icehouse, that the harbor's original common landing rights, granted to Cold Spring Landing's fishing families collectively in a colonial-era charter nearly a century old, had been quietly and improperly consolidated into private ownership by the very fish company that would eventually become Ives and Sons, through a series of land transactions in the 1860s at Fenn, in his capacity as one of the last independent tradesmen still holding older harbor records, had recognized as irregular even at the time. The original charter, copies of which Fenn had preserved among his papers along with his own careful annotations, had granted every fishing family in Cold Spring Landing a permanent, inheritable right to land and process their catch along a specific stretch of the harbor shoreline, a right that predated any private company and that, properly honored, would have prevented the Ives family's predecessors from ever charging the harbor's independent fishermen the docking and processing fees that had, over decades, quietly become one of the fish company's most reliable sources of profit. Fenn's annotations made clear that the original charter had never been formally revoked, merely buried and forgotten as the fish company consolidated its private docks and the harbor's older families, generation by generation, simply accepted the fees as customary without ever questioning the legal foundation beneath them. Constance sat with those papers long into that first night, feeling the peculiar weight of holding, in her own two hands, both an old and largely forgotten grievance and the means, perhaps, to finally correct it. She thought of her father's old lesson about ice and fish both being lessons in patient value, and she thought that Obadiah Fenn, whoever he had truly been beyond these careful pages, had wanted this evidence found by someone who had troubled themselves to finish what his own failing health had never let him pursue. She resolved, with the same quiet stubbornness that had once made her the most trusted grading eye on the whole waterfront, that she would be that someone. The weeks that followed were not gentle ones. Bartholomew Ives, when Constance brought Fenn's papers before him directly, received her with particular defensive politeness of a young man who suspects, without yet admitting it, that he is about to lose an argument he does not fully understand. He suggested that old charters from before the war meant little in the modern legal landscape, that his family's ownership of the harbor's private docks had been properly established for decades, and that an elderly former employee recently let go from his company was, perhaps, not the most disinterested party to be raising such questions. Word spread through Cold Spring Landing quickly and not always kindly. Some of the harbor's older families, comfortable with fees they had simply always paid, were reluctant to see the arrangement disturbed, while others, particularly the harbor's younger and more struggling fishermen, listened with the cautious hope of people who had long suspected something was owed them without ever knowing quite what. Constance did not fight this battle alone for long. She brought Fenn's original charter documents to the county courthouse, where a sympathetic young records clerk confirmed that the colonial-era charter had, indeed, never been formally revoked in any filing the county possessed, only quietly superseded in practice by decades of unchallenged private fee collection. She wrote to Hattie Doyle, the young woman she had once trained and mentored, who had since married a lawyer's clerk in the county seat and who brought the matter, through her husband's modest legal connections, before an attorney willing to examine the charter standing properly. It was this attorney, a careful and unhurried man named Josiah Wren, who confirmed what Fenn's own annotations had long argued, that the original common landing rights, never formally extinguished, remained technically valid, and that the fish company's decades of docking fees, while not necessarily fraudulent in a criminal sense, rested on a legal foundation considerably shakier than Bartholomew Eyes had assumed. Bartholomew did not concede easily. He argued, when the matter came before a county hearing that following spring, that reopening century-old charter rights would throw generations of harbor commerce into chaos, that his family had invested honestly in docks and facilities the harbor's fishermen had always been glad enough to use, and that Constance Rourke's sudden discovery, conveniently timed to her own dismissal, deserved considerable skepticism. But Josiah Wren's careful legal argument, built on Fenn's original charter and corroborated by the county's own unbroken records, proved difficult to dismiss, and when several of the harbor's oldest fishing families, moved by the accumulating evidence and their own long unspoken sense that something had never quite sat right about the fees, testified in support of restoring the common landing rights, the county hearing officer ruled that the original charter remained valid and that the fish company would need to renegotiate its docking arrangements on terms that recognized the harbor family's inherited rights rather than treating them as customary tenants. Bartholomew Eyes did not lose his company, but he lost, in a single spring, both a significant and quietly indefensible portion of his profit and the easy authority he had assumed came automatically with his family name, a lesson delivered not through punishment exactly, but through the plain, corrective way to harbor finally remembering what it had always been owed. Constance Rourke did not seek personal wealth from Fenn's forgotten coin and papers, believing the true value of what she had found lay in the corrected charter rather than the strong box itself, though the modest sum of gold and silver, once properly accounted for, was ruled by the county to belong rightfully to her as the property's owner and finder. She used a portion of it, along with a small settlement the harbor families voted to offer her in gratitude, to repair the old Icehouse itself, not for ice, whose trade was gone for good, but as a proper harbor cooperative building where independent fishermen could grade and pack their own catch without company fees at all, training a new generation of hands, Hattie Doyle's own daughter among them, in the same patient trade her father had once taught her on that very point of land. It is worth returning, before we close, to where we began. A woman of 65, dismissed for the crime of growing too slow for machinery, left with $2 and a lifetime of judgment the world had just called obsolete. Constance Rourke never again worked for Ives and Sons, whose new mechanical grading equipment, as it happened, produced flour of such inconsistent quality that more than one buyer up the coast quietly began routing their business instead to harbor's newly independent cooperative dock. But Constance did not need Ives and Sons any longer. She had, with her 2 remaining dollars, bought back not merely a crumbling building but the plain right to keep being useful in the trade her father had raised her to, and in restoring an old icehouse everyone else called worthless. She had restored, almost as a quiet matter of course, both her own dignity and an entire harbor's rightful inheritance. We began this story with an old woman offering her last $2 for a collapsing icehouse that a dozen townsmen had laughed at even as scrap. We ended with a harbor cooperative built from that same crumbling structure, a forgotten charter finally honored after decades of quiet neglect, and a woman who proved, at 65 years old and with nothing left but her hands and her judgment, that being called too slow for the modern world is not the same thing as being finished with it. Thank you for spending this time with Constance's story. If it moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who has ever been told, too soon or too unfairly, that their working years were behind them. We would love to know, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close